also known as Amehana, and this is Ame Reads. This time I have a very special story for you. It happens to actually be a short story that was written for a friend of mine as a birthday present. It came about as a bit of a jest, and I hope that you enjoy it, because this is not actually in the actual continuity of my storyline completely, and you will find out why. Ocean Pranking by Teresa Garcia. Summer coiled in the moist evening air like lazing curls of blue. Blue what? Kirsty could not be certain. It simply felt blue as it unfurled. Her bedroom window was open a bit to allow in the scent of the sea, and out the scent of the seaweed and much less savory things in her current potion experiment, but not wide enough to allow for contaminants. As always, her dress was meticulously clean so as to prevent any stray hairs from Byron's sheep to fall off and into her brew. With the greatest of care, she measured the last of the ingredients and worked her way through the steps, adding them to her cauldron's brew with careful stirs and soft whispers to the water base, weaving in ancient prayers. Kirsty bit her lip in concentration as she watched the color change from a septic brown to a bright blue while she stirred. The hairs of her half-pelt rose as the energies shifted, and the atomic bonds reformed to hold the new energies being captured. She had been working out this brew since Mother had brought back the samples of the seaweed species that had been returned to the seas from the other world. Which of the other worlds attained had not been certain, only that what she had saved and refused to eat for her daughter was in the world, and that in her boat wreck what was in the hold of the sea witch had made it to the physical ocean, and likely several others at the gate. Part of her chafed, yearning to go explore the sea, to go find in the wild these things the elder priestess witch had released, and to learn their secrets. The rest stayed focused on her work. A soft tap to the right, the waves pushing through the air and softly rippling through her project, and then the door to the hallway was pressed open by a velvet green snout. "Kirsty, that smells terrible. Your mother has sent me up to ask you to open your windows. Can't you brew that one outside on the porch, especially if Connor snuck in Olin's dirty sock again?" Kirsty sighed and rolled her eyes. "Not fully sure about this one yet. It's one of the experiments, Brian, not Olin's nasty laundry." Her voice stayed low and even gentle. "And you know that my potions are never gypsy brews, as effective as those can be." "Picky, picky." The Kelpie clopped softly into her room and looked down into the cauldron at the brew, snorting softly and pointing it away when the vaporous curls wafted it into his large nostrils. He could not help the shakes that came over him and threw his mane and tail about. "You're sure it's not got some of Connor's surströmming? I don't think my sinuses have been this open in years." "Byron!" Kirsty switched sides swiftly, placing herself between him and the heating fire in a move so practiced that the cauldron was left unmoving on the temporary tripod for the rarely used large size. The purple and green of the version of her familial tartan kilt swished about her knees, and her sporran slid once again from her hip to the traditional place in front. Simultaneously she employed a simple shield spell, hoping to prevent any horsehair or spittle from landing in the cauldron and producing an undocumented addition or negative side effect. "Sorry, I suppose you have something in there that doesn't agree with an old Kelpie's sinuses." He proffered a wan smile. "Marsala used to make a soup for her little ones when they were sick. I don't think I've sneezed quite like that since the pups of that generation." Kirsty for a moment looked guilty, and then let the shimmering wall of water and energies disperse back into the air around them. "You're trying to replicate it," he stated with a curl of his lips and a suppressed whinny snort. "She's told you that during one of the sea shifts of that time the most important ingredient that she'd used was no longer to be found ashore, and soon your ancestors couldn't even trade for it with those living beyond and below the 7th or even 9th waves. Marsali said she thought one looked like it was either what she had used or closely related enough to work, from what she could tell. Kirsty's arms crossed, and she became stone, her gaze pinning his and snapping in the depths of her eyes. I trust her judgment. And she can neither smell nor taste now that her essence lives in my painting. A momentarily bitter look crossed his face. His equine lips pressed thin, and a rear hoof clicked the floor. She's not infallible, as old as she and I are. Kirsty glanced over her shoulder at the cauldron, then at the clock on the opposite end of her room, then nodded. Her arms soon wound around his neck, and her nose pressed into his mane. You're not old, Byron. She sniffed quizzically. Cupcakes? Muffins, actually. Carrot. I went to that library I like to visit beyond the Vale. Had tea and a chat with a friend there over a book. Stopped in a pastry place after and nabbed a muffin. Got stared at by all the tiny ones. They think I'm a very strange horse that spends too much time in the water. It's nice when that gate opens, though, and I don't get any odd treatments for being me. I almost fit in, if not for my size, the drips, and the seaweed. Heard something about some legendary pony things that live in the sea. I'd go look for them out of curiosity if I wasn't reluctant to go too far away from that thin area around that forest puddle. Unnoticed to Kirsty, a short dark hair stuck to Byron's coat, transferred to her equally dark shirt, innocently clinging as a child first to father and then to mother. Sounds like a nice place. I'm glad you had a good time. She shifted from foot to foot, then slowly let go and stepped back. Have I been ignoring everyone again, to prompt it? A bit, but it's all right, I suppose. He nuzzled the half-Selkie's cheek softly. When you are finished, though, I think you should spend some time with your mother. She still looks so pale. I know, Byron, I know. Her fingers fisted in his mane and her lips pressed together. I don't suppose that in your ranges you've found anything? No, the magic of that place seems to stay there. I've developed a theory that each world has magic, has to have permission of at least one of the deities of that world for the magic to cross. So, nothing from there to help unless I can talk to their ruler. Doubtful, that. He watched and listened as her forehead pressed against him again, though her body stayed tense and alert to time. You're trying to find a cure for whatever makes her so ill. Yes. Her breath hissed up her nostrils, then back out. He could hear the pain in it and almost could feel it. He certainly tasted the salt on the air from the tears Kirsty held stubbornly behind her eyes. It came from the sea. The cure must as well. I'm positive. I've prayed so hard to Mara and the lady to cure her, Byron. I've made promises that I'm ashamed of and that I'll never breathe to either you or David. Her touch slipped from him, and he heard the click of her boot heels on the floor. Each was a dagger in his heart. Lord Venthrith, or Lady Venthrith, whichever is current, I guess, gave me this riddle. Kirsty's voice swiftly took on the rhyming cadence that the Selkie people used when passing the oral histories. From the greed of man and the sea's pain came the blight. By the hand of man it must be undone and sent to flight. Take the hairs of Mara and my head, and brew of the past. Give to the captain first, then dab figure, bow, stern and mast. Test it well on your own, brew, then bottle which the moon doth swell, if truly you wish your drained brave mother to become well. I'll give you a sign, my child, when you've gotten it right, but you'll want to make sure that you're out of sight. When you make it once again, pour into a bottle green, then once more your mother will slowly gain her sheen. Byron sighed. I think I'd feel better if you didn't listen when the White One gives you a hint on a way to heal her. I would feel much better if you and David worked with your potions master. That is much safer than listening to a trickster deity, and he is far more experienced. He stayed silent on his observations of her gender. Bringing up her feminineness was only going to result in warding off unconscious glances of the eye until her temper calmed, which he had no desire for, and especially not so close to her monthly purging. At least she has more control of the eye than some of her forebears have had, he thought. Kirsty glared at her guardian over one of her desks, this one filled with papers and distilling apparatus. You're afraid. You don't think I can do it because I'm just a child, and you're afraid of Van Thrith. Byron growled. Yes, I am afraid for you and of him. Kirsten Allegra McKay, you're planning on testing a reconstructed brew with substituted ingredients on yourself at the advice of a deity known for driving people mad. You don't know if this particular species of seaweed will have the desired effect once you've got the original potion correct. You have to add hair from Mara and him before you test that to make sure it works. You'll be taking in the essence of a mad god, and one that is not only sick herself, but embittered by the aeons. What do you expect will happen, eh? He growled out further protests in a Gaelic so ancient that Kirsty could not understand, and perhaps only the most learned of the keepers of Mara in the temples could. If it works, then to have my mother back. Her reply was almost softer than Byron was prepared for, and she looked down, bringing a green flask up to examine it and effectively blocking view of her face. Behind the thick green glass and the intervening desk, she hid the tears that finally won free of the imprisonment she had been fighting to keep them under. His bluster died away. Oh, little pup, after everything, do you still think it's your fault? Kirsty nodded and waited for the tears to dry enough to continue her task. Silently, she placed the funnel in her flask and returned to her cauldron. She removed the ladle from its repository and dipped it precisely into the center, whispering over it the song prayer that her ancient ancestress had once sung over the long-ago soups that preserved the lines of Marsally's children and the mariner from the ancient Mackay line, tracing, according to the legends, back to Sir Kay. Unnoticed, the stray hair detached from her shirt and floated into the brew, landing and dissolving just a little before her bronze ladle filled. The color hovered between purple and blue, shifting back and forth between with a pearlescent luminescence that almost seemed to surge on its own. Slowly, carefully, it seemed to pour down between her intensely blue eyes and into the funnel, then the flask, from where Byron stood dripping on her wooden floor. Carefully, Kirsty placed the flask in the cooling rack and repeated the process until her cauldron was empty. Methodically, she extinguished the fire and left the tools to cool after properly cleaning. Byron kept vigil as she did, and her touch only returned to his side when they went down the stairs together. Dinner had been an uncomfortable affair. Etienne was drawn and sickly green moon pale, a ghost within her own body, listlessly pressing through her every movement beneath Finnell's darkened eyes. Father had pressed her to eat more, for both of his girls to eat more. Kirsty was certain that if she had had another bite of hearty fish and sea vegetable pie, that she was going to burst. It, of course, only made her stomach hurt more at the idea of distending one swallow more to make way for the test she intended to do by the light of the moon before the waxing ceased. Waxing to bring in the healing, waning to drive out the ill, like the waves and tides of the seas, had always been admonished whenever someone was brought into the house ill, and after so many short years this had sunk into her marrow. In an effort to make room, she sat propped up in her bed and waited impatiently to digest, gazing out the now wide-open window at the moon, so nearly close to the full, and riding over the restless sea. As the salt tang drifted into her room and the moisture of the air caressed her skin with the soothing touch of Mara, the fish she had eaten fought back and flip-flopped with the rising worries that Byron had fed. The what-ifs had danced and swam in the back of her mind ever since she had prayed to Mara and instead been answered by the moon. They had eaten at her before the gathering had begun, and through the times that Banu and Byron had accompanied her and assisted her. One of the worries that the little chubby toddler Selkie hands had stayed out of her stores during the times she had needed to be gone rose up to the top. Now, though, it was nearly too late, and she knew it would be a waste if she tossed the whole batch on just the paranoid suspicion that things had not been as mishap-free as she had striven for. Kirsty waited for the sounds of the house to quiet. At last the house was completely quiet, and she had room in her stomach. Padding on taciturn feet to her work area, she breathed a silent prayer to the moon to bless her, that this brew would be correct. Hushed breath slipped in and out as the seconds dilated, and she lifted the flask to her lips. Several sets of invisible eyes watched as her eyes slipped shut, and the viscous fluid flowed past her lips and tumbled down her throat. For Kirsty, her world became a war of heat and chill, desert and ice flowing in her veins outward from her stomach. Sound and smell fell away, up and down were no more, out became in, and she found herself held at the crux of something far beyond understanding. "Well, this is not something I expected to see, ever. What did you do to my child?" The screech was unheard by Kirsty, the possessor miles and worlds away, separated by the veil between realities. Grey sharkskin-covered forearms now were gripped by large sword-calloused hands. "Our child will be fine, Mara. Relax." The voice was deep and high at once, as if the owner could not decide just how he wanted to sound at the time. "She has fur and a tail," Mara snorted as Venthrift and his rougher guys pulled her against him and waited for her struggles to slow. Mara never could be completely still, lest the sea do likewise. "Hasn't she always? I rather think this is an improvement. Look at how healthy all that fur looks, and her magnificent mane. We could dye her green, get her all wet, and she would almost make a halfway decent kelpie." He laughed loudly, the corners of his eyes crinkling and the tip of his white goatee brushing Mara's shoulder. Mara elbowed his gut sharply. "No." "What is that thing on her flanks?" Another female voice joined, as another male voice snorted. "I don't like it. Turn her back and stop using them as a drama for at least a couple months," the male voice rumbled. "I liked her much better when she was facing down the sea unicorn." Mara glared at Hearn, who shrugged, unfazed by her glare. "Well, I did. She was herself. That short little pony certainly isn't her being herself. No fangs." The antlered deity drew his hood back slightly, exposing the face that only they could see, instead of the cosmos that others saw, and mimed a set of fangs with his roughened forefingers. "I guess the flank decorations could almost be interesting tattoos." "Almost." Mara sniffed a bit, but did smile slightly at the display. Hearn kept looking at Venthrift over Mara's shoulder, his eyes battling with the moon. "Oh, fine. She's managed to get it right anyway, I think. Other than the pony fuzz, I mean." He snapped his fingers. Unaware of the discussion happening around Mara and her sister's gazing shell, time once again began to flow for Kirsty. Her eyes opened and her stomach cramped. Despite the heaving, she managed to retain her contents and gazed quizzically at her work desks. "Oh dear, did I shrink? Did I lose my balance?" Kirsty tried to stand up, only to discover that her body did not answer her the same way it had. Looking down, she tried to figure out just what on earth kept brushing the backs of her legs. "Oh, no way. No." Familiar laughter floated to her from the sea as the silver path from moon to land began to form. Kirsty sighed and glared at the moon. "I suppose this is what you meant by a sign that I'd want to be alone for it? That's a really dirty trick, you know." She continued to grumble and clambered into her bed as well as she could, thankful that her room was larger on the inside than the outside. "I hope this wears off before Byron sees me and says he told me so."